deep hole in the cloud. That's Frank Howard's footprints. Hey everyone, this is Will O'Toole welcoming you to another edition of Park Ridge Sports History. This week, I'm going to do a little bit of half the show on one Buckeye and then finish up with another Buckeye, and I'm talking about the late Bobby Knight. Welcome. Both Ohio State Buckeyes, each just missed each other's college career. Both played basketball for the Buckeyes. Frank Howard was a pretty good player in basketball, and Knight was just a player off the bench. However, Knight did play on a national championship team under Fred Taylor, while Frank Howard played for basically mediocre teams with the Buckeyes. His first team, they went 16-6 under Fred Stahl. Then they went 14-8, never made the NCAA tournament. And then in his final season under Floyd Stahl, the Buckeyes went 9-13. But I really want to concentrate on not just the basketball, but also the great life of Frank Howard as a baseball player. And he was a masher playing for the Washington Senators, the new Washington Senators. And I will tell you this, he died last week. I was kind of disappointed that I didn't see anything on the Rangers, like a little black band for Frank Howard, as they do win their first world championship in the franchise's history, which goes all the way back to 1961 with the then Washington Senators, who, of course, replaced the old Washington Senators / Nationals, who went on to Minnesota to become the Minnesota Twins with Harmon Killebrew and Bobby Allison and Jim Cott and a host of others. But Frank Howard was, to me, and of course I'm being very prejudiced when I say this, he just embodied the 1960s and early 70s for me as a baseball fan. I just remember how big he was. And the only guy I can equate him to right now is, although quote unquote, he's probably a better athlete, and that's Aaron Judge. Although, Frank Howard played basketball. He was a pretty good basketball player. Averaged 20 points his senior year with the Buckeyes. So during the 50s, when they weren't scoring like they were today, I know that Judge played football at Fresno State, obviously a baseball player, probably has better speed. He's obviously, or he was, right now he is a better defensive player than Frank Howard ever was. But that is not to besmirch the talents of Frank Howard. It really just shows you how far the giant players have come in baseball, that they are just so much more versatile. I think Frank Howard probably would have been better suited, and of course it was late in his career, to be a designated hitter. He probably had the designated hitter earlier in his career, maybe about 1965, 66. Who knows? Maybe he's never traded from Los Angeles to the Washington Senators, that LA just inserts him into the DH role, and that's it, and Frank goes on. But actually, Frank was kind of happy. He was traded. I was reading a couple of essays on him, one from Saber. He was kind of happy that he got a chance to play every day with the Senators instead of being kind of platooned, and that he, even though RFK Stadium, where he toiled, and I mean toiled, because outside of 1969, the Senators were never a good baseball team as the new franchise. It's one of the new franchises in the American League. But RFK was an okay place to hit, but it was certainly better than the confines of Dodger Stadium. And Dodger Stadium, of course, has always been perceived as a pitcher's park. And, of course, during the 60s, when there wasn't a lot of hitting of home runs and the offense was kind of down in baseball, you had two great pitchers in L.A. in Chavez Ravine, Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale, just putting up goose eggs, it seemed like, every fourth day for the Dodgers as they won a number of pennants and World Series, basically on clutch hitting and great overpowering hitting and good defense. They didn't have great defensive players. Willie Davis was perceived as a really good defensive center fielder, but in 66, of course, in the World Series, he did commit 3 errors all in one inning. And it wasn't the first time. But Davis, when I was a kid, he was always seen as a pretty good defensive fielder. But they also had players like Tommy Davis, who was a really good hitter, and Frank Howard, who was a thumper, but not really good defensive players. They did have Wes Parker at first base, but then they had guys like Jim Lefevre, Billy Grabarkowitz. Maury Wills did anchor shortstop for a while there, especially 62, 63, but then, he's cast off. They had okay offensive catchers / defensive players like Tom Haller and Johnny Roseborough, but those Dodger teams consisted really of overpowering pitching, timely hitting, and just pretty good defense. When Howard was traded, they did get Claude Osteen back, who was an effective, I would say, like number 3, number 4 starter, and he was a lefty. But keeping on the fact that it's Frank Howard, he goes over to the Senators and does have some success, but he really has his greatest seasons under the tutelage of course, the splendid Splinter, and that is Ted Williams. And prior to that, I just wanted to show you this. Actually, when he was at Ohio State, he averaged his sophomore year. I'm just going to go back to his sophomore season. The Buckeyes were 16-6 under Floyd Stahl. Frank Howard was 6'6". As I recall, I think he grew 2 inches when he got to the major league. He averaged 15 points and 12 rebounds a game playing forward. The next season with the Buckeyes, ready for this? He averaged 20 points a game as a junior, 6'6", and 15 rebounds. And then his final season with the Buckeyes, unfortunately, they were under 500. They didn't even win double digits. They were 9-13. They do actually have an NBA pick on that team, a fellow by the name of Joe Roberts, who averaged 3.5 points for that team. Howard was 16.9 with 13.6 rebounds. Joe Roberts, never heard of him until I was just going over this, but he played 72 career games at Ohio State and averaged 8.6 a game. He was taken in the 1960 overall draft NBA. I guarantee it's probably with the Cincinnati Royals because there was regional, or there was kind of like at the time the NBA had rights to certain players in regions. And he was selected by, ready for this? Dick Furry was drafted from Ohio State by the Knicks, and I still can't see Joe Roberts. Here he is. Joe Roberts was selected by Syracuse. The Syracuse Royals, or actually the Syracuse Nationals. I think they would move on to Cincinnati to become the Cincinnati Royals in that after that season. But anyway, Joe Roberts would actually play for the NCAA champion Ohio State Buckeyes, who Bobby Knight would also be a teammate of. And that's really the crazy kind of things here. And I know I went off on a tangent here. I really want to go back to Frank Howard. But Howard was a pretty good player in basketball at college, and I think he probably would have been selected had he not gone for baseball. I just want to give you this, though. He was a Rookie of the Year for the Dodgers. And for some reason, man, oh man, the Dodgers in the 60s and the 70s, and then in the 80s, and of course they are the all-time leading National League team in most Rookies of the Years. It's almost every year it seems to be with them that they always have a rookie candidate. For a while there, I think they won 4 or 5 in a row. As a kid, I just remember Frank Howard winning it in 62. They did have Jim Lefevre, who won it in 65, although it probably should have been Joe Morgan. But Lefevre had the edge in the fact that the Dodgers would win the pennant and go on and win the World Series. Plus, he's in L.A., not Houston, and L.A. was an established pennant contending type of team. Morgan was trying to turn the Astros into a winning franchise. But nevertheless, he finally gets his full-time duty in 1962 with the Dodgers, playing 141 games. He hit 31 home runs with 119 RBIs. And what's interesting about that is that he would only have, and I was surprised about this, he would only have 4 years of 100 or more RBIs. 3 of them, obviously, with the Washington Senators, all 3 in a row, and 2 of them under Ted Williams. Anyway, let's get back to this. He is traded. I think he got hurt, but he is on the 63 Dodger team. He only played 123 games, still belted 28 home runs, still hit 273. Actually, ready for this? In 61 and 62, he had back-to-back seasons of 296. And it's interesting because in 1970, he would also hit 296 actually in 69, he would also hit 296. So that would seem to be a number for a batting average that he seemed to fall in love with. Could never quite get the 300, but he was an unbelievable power hitter. Anyway, getting all back, because you know how I go off on tangents. As I like to tell you guys, my audience, just imagine we're sitting having a couple of brews and a hamburger after a game, and we're just thinking off the top of our heads, and one thing leads into another. So even though I start with the theme of Frank and Bobby Knight, I will go off on tangents. I'm not apologizing, because this is, to me, how real sports conversations develop and how much fun you can have with them and how you can spend hours upon hours just hashing through old games, great players, and the oddities of the sports themselves. That all being said, Frank, at least, I was always happy about this. Even though he won it with the Dodgers, I was glad that he does win a World Series. And in 63, he hit a bomb at Yankee Stadium. And I think it was off Whitey Ford. He hit a bomb and he was only 25 years old. But that was really, he was 3 for 10 in the World Series, a 300 batting average. He had some extra base hits in that series, but he really showed everyone what he could do, and especially at massive left center field at Yankee Stadium. But by the time he was 26, ready for this, he already had 38, 69. He had almost 100 home runs. He had 99 home runs by the time 1964 was rolling around, and he gets to that Bill James age of 27. And it's a shame. That was also his final year with the Dodgers. Even though he was still thumping the ball, he does slump in 64, and I think the Dodgers listened to their old GM, Branch Rickey, get rid of a player a year too soon rather than a year too late. They probably saw that maybe Frank wasn't going to be able to handle the outfield. He certainly wasn't going to supplant Wes Parker at first base. The Dodgers were on their run of winning or contending for the pennant in 62, 63, 64, and 65. Actually, in 63 and 65, they win the World Series. And then in 66, they win the pennant and, of course, lose to the Orioles. Something I almost forgot when I was doing a Brooks Robinson tribute. How did I almost forget that? It's unbelievable. But he had 23-15. He only played 92 games in 61. I do believe he got hurt that year from an article I was reading on Sabre. But he bounces back, 62, 31, 119. And in fact, ready for this, he finishes 9th in the MVP. He does pick off the Rookie of the Year in 1960 with 2377 and 268. He only drew, though. Well, and I'm going to get back to that. Ready for this? The Rookie of the Year that year, that was the year Maris wins it, his first one in the American League as MVP. Dick Groat won it in the National League, more than likely for his defense and the fact that the Pirates hadn't won a pennant since 1927. And, of course, they go on and win the World Series because he certainly, quote-unquote, didn't lead by WAR. In fact, Willie Mays was the leader in WAR. He probably should have won it again in 1960. Vern Law was the Cy Young for the Pirates that year. And the Rookie of the Year was a guy by the name of Ron Hansen, who I think might have been the last Chicago White Sox to turn a unassisted triple play when he was traded to them. But he had a pretty good year, Ron Hansen, but never was able to duplicate this for the Orioles. 22, 86, and 255. Frank Howard finished ahead of Pancho Herrera, who had 17 homers, 71 RBIs. I didn't know this, but he was I think he was an infielder first baseman. Art Mahaffey, who would go on to be a well-known pitching coach. He was 7-3 for the Phillies that year, 2.31 ERA with 12 saves. Ron Santo finished fourth. He only had a .9 WAR, had 9 homers, 44 RBIs, 251, and Tommy Davis was finishing fifth. He had a 2.3 WAR. He actually had a higher WAR than Frank Howard too. I think though that Howard, you could argue, had the most robust. He played 117 games, had 23 home runs. Remember, he's playing in Dodger Stadium most of the time. 77 runs batted in, had 32 walks, hit 268. I got to be very honest with you. Tommy Davis, this is where I have problems with WAR. Tommy Davis played the same amount of games, 110. He hit half the home runs and had half the RBIs, and hit only 8 points higher, and actually had a lower on-base percentage than Frank Howard. And he was never known to be a great defensive player. Indeed, he wasn't. Played first in the outfield, very much like Frank Howard, and yet he finishes with a higher WAR. And again, this is what I always say. Just explain to me where you're getting the rationale with the WAR. He finishes 2.3 to 2 for Frank Howard. Now, again, as I'm going off on a tangent with WAR, doesn't seem like a lot, 0.3, but it really is in how they measure all these things. Anyway, he has a great, he comes as the sophomore jinx, we used to like to call it. I think he got hurt, but yet he hits 296 with 15 and 45, 92 games. So he probably would have finished, probably if he played 117, or even if he played, let's say, 140 like he did the following year. Maybe he has 25 and 70 with a 296 average. Still doesn't pick up a lot of walks. 62, of course, the Dodgers play in the playoffs against the Giants, that 3-game series. They don't win. The Giants win the pennant. But for all his work, ready for this? He had 25 doubles, 6 triples, 31 home runs, 119 RBIs. Does strike out for the second time in his career 108 times. And that would be actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of the next 10 seasons. Frank would strike out over 100 times. The one year that he did in 1969, struck out only 96. Now, that's the great segue. In 69, after he has a great season in 68, in fact, he makes the All-Star team and starts in Houston. Frank's year that year in 68, 158 games, 79 runs scored, 28 doubles, 3 triples, okay, as a 30-year-old, not known for being fleet of foot. In fact, I wanted to do something. Frank had 8 career stolen bases out of 17 attempts. I may do this during the summer when I have a little more time and I'm working on an all-star story. But I would love to see what 8 catchers he stole bases off. Probably surprise us. Maybe some of them might be Hall of Famers or known to have guns for arms. But he was, in his last year with Detroit, he goes into the under 500 mark for stolen bases. He was actually thrown out once with no stolen bases in his last year at age 36 in the major leagues. But ready for this, in 68, he bashes out to lead the league, 44 home runs. And remember, he's hitting, this is the worst season probably in baseball history in terms of offense. He hit 274. Remember, Corey Yastrzemski led the American League with a 301 batting average. And the second guy who was in the order, I think, was Ted Uhlaender, who hit 288. So there's only one guy in the American League who hit 300 that year. He hits 274. Well, lo and behold, but he struck out 141 times. Does increase. Actually, he drew 50 or more walks from 1964 to 68. Again, there's a reason why I say that. 1969, Ted Williams, the Splendid Splinter, probably the greatest student on the science of hitting. And if you've never read his book, you should read his book. Even just the illustrations. It's Ted Williams with the box that they now imitate on the baseball broadcasts. It's kind of like a ripoff of what Williams did. Williams broke down. He has his own strike zone, and he has it basically done, I would say, like almost square inches of where he has a real hot zone where his batting average is like 400, where he gets the pitch, maybe up and in, and then down and away, maybe it's a different color. Let's say it's green or yellow, and he hits, let's say, 154. But he has this box that has all these different colors in it with baseballs, and it indicates where his personal batting average and how well he hit the ball based on the batting average in this box. Well, I've seen Baseball Now do it, the broadcast. Kind of a ripoff. Anyway, Ted Williams comes in, and the first thing he says to Frank Howard, has a guy who hits all these home runs, only walks, let's say, 50 times a year. And basically I was reading the article, and what Ted Williams asked him to do was take the first fastball. And by doing that, he said he would see more pitches, earn more walks, but he would still hit just as many home runs. Well, I will tell you this. One thing I think that embodies Frank Howard is that I always saw him as being a great teammate, everything about team first. Now, I don't know anything about him in the locker room or anything. He just seemed to epitomize the classic team player. Wasn't upset when the Dodgers traded him, did want to play more, embraced going to Washington, saw it as an opportunity. Maybe he'll never play for another pennant contender, but lo and behold, he embraces going to Washington. And fortunately, really, after 68, he gets under the managership of Ted Williams, and Williams just says, look, just take more walks, take a few more pitches. Howard listens, and ready for this, hits the same amount. Well, he hits 4 more home runs, plays 3 more games, has 39 more at bats, so he goes from 663 to 702. He has he has only 17 doubles, 2 triples, but he hits 4 more home runs, 48, drives in 5 more RBIs for 111, hits 296, and his on-base percentage is for the first time in his career over 400. It was 402. Why? Ted Williams, convinced him to take walks. He draws 102 walks in 1969. And it was the only year that Washington, under Williams, was over 500. They did win 86 games, but you got to remember, 86 games may have gotten you into a playoff position. It may have gotten you into a playoff race or a pennant race. But you got to remember, that year the Orioles won 109 games. They finished like 23 games behind. How many times does a team win 86 games and finish 23 games, almost 23 games behind the division leader? It's unbelievable. But here's what he does do, though. By getting on base more, he improves from 79 runs scored to 111. Basically, he improves by 50% on his runs scored. And to show, and he does make the All-Star team. And he does make the All-Star team in 1970. Doesn't start. I don't think he starts. Oh, and here's the other thing I love about 1969. He does start the All-Star game. And I do believe he might be the last American League slugger to hit an All-Star home run in his own ballpark. I do believe that. And before you go out and say, I'll bet $50 on it, I'm pretty sure I was doing some studies on it because it was pretty wild, because I do remember that game so well. He hit a bomb to right center field in that All-Star game that kind of gave maybe the American League a little courage, a little hope. But then the National League scores 5 runs, I think, the next inning, and it's over. That was the game that McCovey bashes 2, Bench hits 1, was robbed of another one by Yastrzemski and all the rest. I just remember that one. It's the very first game I ever watched in its entirety. I watched it with my brother Jim, and it was rain. It's just a great memory game for me. I almost can remember pitch by pitch on that. But in 69, he had 48, 111, 296 batting average. And then he follows that in 70, hits 44 home runs again. This time leads the American League in RBIs with 126. In fact, he led the American League in home runs. Does lead in walks with 132. And hits 283, has a 416 on-base percentage, and scores 90 runs. Okay, they were down a little bit. He only hit 15 doubles, had 1 triple, but really, he became a better all-round player under the tutelage of Ted Williams. He does finish out his career. He does move, and so does Williams. That year, 1970, my brother, when we were talking about this, in 71, Washington's last year at RFK, they were actually beating the Yankees on the final game, and the fans rioted. And so they lost a forfeit game. And I do believe, and I'll look it up again, but I think Howard had the last home run in old Washington Senator history before they move and become the Texas Rangers. Now you understand why I was upset that the Rangers didn't do anything for that team. I mean, here was a great guy for the game of baseball. Definitely a presence. I mean, how could you miss this guy? A big hulking guy, 6'8", 2. Baseball Reference, that's the only thing I might disagree with them on in terms of statistics. They have him a very low, let's say 220, 230, I think they list him as. And from what I understood, they have him as 255, excuse me. I seem to recall people saying he was even heavier than that. But if you see some of his pictures for the Topps baseball cards, you would agree he was massive, just massive. He wasn't cut and muscular like Aaron Judge, but he was just a big guy. He's no one to fool with. But even at Texas, in his last good year, he hit 279, 2683. You got to remember, though, Texas stunk. I think they didn't even win that first year. I don't even think they won 60 games. I think they won 54, and that was a strike-shortened season. So that I do believe they just barely missed losing 100. But his career does wind up with Detroit. He does get to play for the 72 Detroit Tigers in their pennant run, but doesn't play in the playoffs. And then he goes off to Japan. And he is that's where he actually retires as a professional player and hitter extraordinaire. All right, my last one is this. I got a few minutes here. Welcome, Bobby Knight. Now, of course, people don't realize this. Bobby Knight, like Frank Howard, matriculated, like Hank Stram would say, at Ohio State, although he's talking about a football field and a game. I'm talking about going to school. But both players were alums of Ohio State. Didn't realize this. I reread an article by Frank DeFord on Bobby Knight, and didn't realize he was an outstanding football player, but he was a really good baseball player. And Bobby Knight, and I don't think he was a braggart at all. I just think he was very confident. He said that he could hit the baseball a country mile. And I'm thinking he's like 6'5". Knight never gave off that look of being real big. I know he was an imposing guy. I didn't realize how tall he was. He was like 6'4", 6'5". I thought maybe 6'1", 6'2". I always thought he was kind of like a small forward, like a guard, and in between, or maybe 6'3". Didn't realize he was 6'5". And he apparently could hit the ball a country mile. And indeed, some people thought that his better sport was baseball, but he just loved basketball. He goes to Ohio State. As usual, Knight didn't get along with the coach all that well. I think it's two great coaching minds. Fred Taylor's an old one. Bobby Knight, the young, maturing one, probably clashed over egos and playing time and also play calling and philosophy of coaching and all the rest of it. But he does get his first job at Army, and it's amazing. He won 3 titles, 76, 81, and 87. The beat Dean Smith in 81, beat uh, Syracuse in 87, and of course beat Johnny Orr in 1976, the Michigan Wolverines. That was the year that Rutgers made it to the Final Four, and UCLA did as well. And he vanquished UCLA and Gene Bartow, who had taken over for John Wooden. Over 2 years, I think they were 32-0 and 31-1. They lost to Kentucky when Scott May, this is 75, broke his arm, and not in that game, but tried to play against Kentucky and just couldn't. And they basically lost the game, lost to Kentucky, and they lost only by a couple of points. But May wasn't able to play. Spurred on by that fact, they come back and they just destroy everybody in 1976. In fact, the closest that I recall outside of trailing Michigan at halftime in the 76 championship was they played in the Holiday Festival against St. John's. And St. John's was led by a guy named Beaver Smith, one of my favorite all-time St. John's players. And, of course, Lou Carnesecca was at the helm for the Redmen. And they were leading late in that game at the Holiday Festival. And obviously Indiana rallied and secured the victory and won the Holiday Festival. But as I recall, that was really the only game I remember Indiana having any worries about winning throughout the season. Then, of course, instead of Knight ripping into his players at halftime for the championship in the NCAA tournament, he came in and said, hey, you're 30 minutes away from, or 20 minutes away from destiny or something like that, or words to that effect. And they just came out and turned a halftime deficit into an 18-point victory, and it could have been more. They just simply outplayed the Wolverines in the second half. That team, of course, they had a number of guys I can remember. Tom Abernathy. They had Jim Cruz. I think he was like a super sub who would go on and coach at Evansville. They had Scott May, of course, who was consensus All-American, Player of the Year, the whole 9 yards. Never really lived up to that. In, you know what? His game really didn't equate to the NBA. Plus, he was playing on a mediocre type of Bull team that was going through a transition. They had lost Bob Love and Chet Walker, and they were going through it. And I think he gets injured too in the NBA. But he never fulfilled any kind of expectations that we were hoping for in the NBA. Regardless, he's a great college player. And of course, they had Kent Benson at center, although he did not jump center. It was Bobby Wilkerson, who does get hurt in that championship game. I think he had a concussion. And then, of course, probably one of my favorite players of all time. He was one of the few guys I remember playing two sports at once, and that was Quinn Buckner. He was a running back, fullback, I believe, on the Indiana Hoosiers team, football team, and then would segue over and play basketball. And I think Knight asked him, look, do you want to be beat up all the time, or do you want to play for a national championship unbeaten team? And Buckner, I think, quit the football team and just put his full focus on the Hoosier basketball program. And of course, he was a good player, not offensive, not what we would talk today as being offensively challenged. Didn't score a lot, but he had a presence, good defensive player, good playmaker. And he did have a few years, and I think he does play for the Celtics on a championship team in the NBA. So those guys all do make it in the pros, or they're selected. I think Wilkerson, had a cup of coffee. I know he was drafted because he was just a really good athlete. And I just don't remember his, again, another guy who just, maybe his game just didn't work in the NBA. But I just remember him jumping center, and it was kind of cool because he was about 6'4", maybe 6'6", and he jumped center, not Kent Benson. And, of course, Benson would play for the Milwaukee Bucks, I believe, and he had about 4 or 5 years in the NBA. He looked like the typical Hoosier that you think of when you see the movie Hoosiers, right? Big, blonde-haired, looked like he baled hay during the summer, work the plow and all the rest of it. And I'm not trying to be stereotypical. He just embodied that Indiana farm kid generalization that we make. But that team was great. They're still the last unbeaten team to go through the whole season and then make the tournament and go through that unbeaten. And of course, that's why I have the Bobby Knight. But what I'm saying with Bobby Knight is this. His first job, and probably you could actually argue, I've actually argued this, that his greatest coaching was not at Indiana winning those 3 championships. It was probably during the Vietnam War era at Army. He led Army. Ready for this? Army was 18-8 when he was 25 years old. He does lose the number 5 Vandy. I compiled his record against top 20 teams or top 25 teams, and I was disappointed. He actually finishes with a record of 156 and 164 against top 25 teams in his NCAA career. However, while he was at Indiana, his record was 120 and 93, and there was one season, I think it was 1976, where he actually went 10-0 in 76 after going 9-1 and 10-4 the previous 2 years. But he goes 72 when he first got to Indiana. He's 5-3, then 10-4, 9-1, 10-0. Goes down a little bit, 1-6, 4-2, 4-7. All right, to compile a record of 120 and 93 against top 25 teams in while he was at Big Ten Indiana. But like I said, his first year he was 18-8. He goes 2-2 in the NIT because at that time they did play consolation games. In 66-67 they go down a little bit. They go 13-8. He lost to Ohio State by 2 points that year, and he lost to Princeton, which was number 8 in the country. 67-68 they are 20-5. He beat Illinois. He beat Syracuse, and I think it might have been the same first or second year. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Beat Syracuse by 20. He beat Rutgers and St. John's, which was ranked number 5. Lost to St. John's, excuse me. Beat Seton Hall. He beat Seton Hall his first year. He beat Seton Hall his second year. He beat Seton Hall his third year. In 68-69, he finally lost to Seton Hall. He plays Kentucky. He beat South Carolina in the NIT, and he lost to BC. And ready for this, in the 1969-70 season, then he goes 22-6, in 69-70. He beat that year San Francisco, Maryland, Virginia Tech, Rutgers, beat Seton Hall, and Syracuse. Then goes 3-1 in the NIT. Now, you got to remember, I'm being prejudiced when I say this. I remember the 70 NIT. My cousin played in it he was with Georgetown that year. I got to see him play against Manhattan at Madison Square Garden the previous February. Then I got to see him on TV in March. I thought that was the coolest thing. That was Channel 2 carrying the NIT. They happened to play LSU and lost by a point. And, of course, that LSU team had Pete Maravich. Well, wouldn't you know it? And I forgot about this, but Army was in the same tournament. They beat Cincinnati. They beat a good Manhattan team. I think Manhattan, actually my cousin Timmy Mercier, had the most points in his career at that game that we attended, and it was against Manhattan. They do lose to Manhattan. Manhattan, I think, had 18 or 19 wins that season. They were really good. Army loses to St. John in the semifinals, but then beats LSU in the consolation. Now, you can say, big deal. But here's the deal. For Army to win the consolation was a big deal. For LSU, they probably just wanted to go home. I can understand that. They were probably tired and all the rest of it. I think they only finished the season 15-14. But for Army, it was big. And for Knight, who's, 26, 27 years old, it's a big deal. There was a lot of pride for Army on that. His last year, unfortunately, 1970-71, the Black Knights of the Hudson, they go 11-13. And I think that is one of 2 seasons that Knight is under 500 in his career. And of course, I will tell you this, when he leaves Indiana to go to Texas Tech, that is when him playing top 20 teams and not doing so well, it really does fade because during those years in the Big 12, they were only 34 and 65, or Knight was 34 and 65 against other Big 12 teams. Kansas, Oklahoma State. Now, he was trying to build a program. I'm not trying to use any excuses. Texas Tech has never been known for being a big basketball program or having a great basketball history as opposed to Indiana. But in both situations, Knight was trying to build a program. Much easier when you have tradition and your school is just steeped in basketball history as opposed to Texas Tech, which is more football oriented. Nevertheless, doesn't fare well against Big 12 opposition, and that's why his final record against top 25 is 156 and 164. But nevertheless, he won over 900 games, 3 national titles, an NIT while with Indiana, and many more important to him and to Indiana, his kids graduated. This is Will O'Toole, remembering the lives of both Frank Howard and Bobby Knight, 2 Ohio State Buckeyes who passed just recently. Thanks for joining. See you next week with another Park Ridge Sports History.